Now let's talk about the idea of an emergency fund. We're talking about this next because typical financial wisdom will say this is something that you should get going early on as soon as you can. So usually this is step one of getting out of living paycheck to paycheck. So in other words, ideally, your spending and your expenses won't take up all of your paycheck or your money that you have coming in. There will be some left over. Now, that may be hard to achieve when you first start out, let's be realistic. But when you start to see that gap between how much you're bringing in and how much needs to go back out, then you can start thinking about what to do with that excess. And this is one of the first places to think about putting that money is into emergency funds. Let's think about what an emergency fund is. It's a bit what it sounds like. So it is an amount of money that would be available to you to support you in case of emergency. For example, let's say you lost your job unexpectedly, right? That would be one example of an emergency situation. So what is this? We're going to talk about what this does for you a little bit later on, but let's start by talking about how much money you need. Now, you will often hear people talk about ideally you need a 6 months emergency fund, right? An emergency fund that could keep you going for 6 months in case of emergency. And most people hear that and it sounds like mission impossible, particularly when you're first starting out. And we'll talk about that. Some people will say, well, you only need 3 months, particularly if you are in a household that has multiple incomes, or if you are, it would be relatively easy for you, such as a professional, as a lawyer, to find another job, right? But something more than zero. How much you need is really up to you, and there's a variety of factors to consider, and one of them should be your comfort level, right? And it doesn't mean that you need to start with the amount you might ultimately want to have. Right. So again, it may seem impossible from you from where you are now to get those bigger amounts, but let's talk about how you get there because it's not always easy, but it's often more realistic than people think. So we're not talking about, first to be clear, we're not talking about replacing your salary, right? So let's say you make $100,000 a year, just to keep the numbers easy. We're not saying if you have 6 months of emergency fund, that means you need $50,000 sitting around, right? We're talking about replacing as much of your take-home pay as you need to be comfortable in an emergency. And we'll drill down in that a little bit more. So if you have a $100,000 salary and suddenly you're out of work, you don't need to replace $50,000 over the course of 6 months because you weren't taking home $50,000, right? Taxes were being taken out of that. So first of all, we're starting by we're looking to be able to cover your expenses for a period of time in case of emergency, not replace all of your pay or your take-home pay necessarily, right? So first, so that's just dialing it down, step one, right? That we're not talking about the bigger target of your whole salary, we're talking about take-home pay. Then the next thing you want to do to dial it down is think about, we're not talking about your replacing your normal budget or covering your normal budget for a period of time, right? So the next step to get this down to a reasonable amount that you actually need is to start with your normal budget, right? We talked about budgets. Now, if you put together a normal budget for yourself, and then you want to take that, sort of make a copy and then dial that down into an emergency budget, because your budget, if you were in an emergency situation, probably doesn't look the same as your budget in a normal situation probably doesn't look the same as your budget in an emergency situation. So for example, let's say you have commuting costs in your normal budget, but then you lose your job and you're not commuting. Well, that expense would change. Let's say you have a dog and you send them to doggy daycare while you're at work. Well, in an emergency situation, would you still do that? Would you spend less on food? Would you spend more on other things? So you want to sit there and think, in an emergency situation, what would change about the way I spend money? What would change about my expenses? And you create for yourself an emergency budget, right? So then from there, right, so this is the amount of money I need, right? You can think of it as per month, for example. This is the amount of money I need to cover my expenses in an emergency situation. And then from there, you can subtract. So let's say after all that, you think, okay, if I was in an emergency situation, I would need we'll make up numbers, right? I would need $2,500 a month to get by. From there, you can subtract any other sources of income you may have. So for example, maybe you live with someone else, right? And that partner, it has an income as well, right? And you're going to make the reasonable assumption that you wouldn't both lose jobs at the same time, that's not something that you think is realistic enough that you want to plan around. So you would subtract that other source of income, right? So let's say you have, I need to cover $2,500 and that's my entire budget. The other person's bringing in 2,000. Okay, well now the gap is $500, right? So you want to think about what are other sources of income. It may also be that you do something else on the side that brings an extra income, and you would expect that that wouldn't go away at the same time if you lost a job. Maybe if it was another type of emergency, you wouldn't be able to do that work. So you want to think about what other income can I reasonably expect to be coming in the door, if any, in an emergency situation. Subtract that from the amount you need, right? And that gets down to the amount you really need. That amount that we've drilled down to is what you're now multiplying by 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is, that period of time that you want to have around, right? So still can be a significant goal to shoot for, but is usually much more doable and attainable as compared to 6 months of a full normal budget or salary, right? Then you can also, of course, start with a smaller amount of money and then increase it to get to whatever your goal is. Maybe it's 3 months, 6 months, whatever, right? As you can. Now, let's think about what this does for you. First of all, the peace of mind is huge, right? And being able to say, knowing that if you had an emergency tomorrow, you'd be okay for however long you're comfortable with, right? So the peace of mind. But then if you do have an emergency, right? So it gives you peace of mind right now, thinking about what if something happened, right? Knowing you'd be okay. But then if you do have an emergency, and of course, hopefully not, then in that moment, you could focus on taking care of yourself and maybe others and getting through it instead of the financial picture being an additional source of stress in an already stressful emergency situation. The other thing that this does for you is you worked so hard to get where you are now, and it would really be a shame to see all that you've created for yourself at risk because of an emergency, right? Don't want to see your goals and your life and your finances derailed in case of an emergency. So this really gives you some security, right? And it protects against the rest of your financial picture, right? If you have an emergency, but you have an emergency fund to cover that, then your finances aren't disrupted, right? You have a financial plan for an emergency. Your emergency budget is your plan for a financial emergency. And then if an emergency happens, you just follow the plan without a larger scale financial disruption. So keep in mind as well, we talked about income creep, right? The idea that sometimes you're used to a smaller amount of spending, and then as your income increases, you increase your spending rather than the gap between your income and your expenses growing. So this is a good goal to accomplish before you start increasing your, if possible, of course, right? But before you fully start increasing your spending, if you do, as your income increases, this is a good goal to consider earlier on before you may get used to having those that larger amount of spending.